I don't understand what possible justification could be put forward for stamping on somebody's head when they're on the floor. It just beggars belief. But then it's this debate that then has sort of come out of it, and actually, potentially irresponsible debate as well, which will just stoke up tensions that perhaps don't need to be stoked when the incident itself should speak for itself and should be dealt with.
Now, Greater Manchester Police are investigating footage of an armed police officer kicking and stamping on a man's head. The video of the incident at Manchester Airport has been shared widely on social media. It shows a uniformed officer holding a taser over a man lying on the floor and striking him twice as his colleagues shout at onlookers to stay back. I'm joined now by the former Met Police Detective Superintendent Shabnam Chowdhury. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
You've seen this video. What's your reaction to it?
Well, I've actually watched it twice, and I have to say it's absolutely shocking and quite horrific to watch. And I appreciate that we're looking at a clip of an incident, but it's a really disturbing incident in my personal view.
The force says firearms officers were subjected to a violent assault. Is there any instance which justifies the use of force we can see in this video?
Look, if you look at the video immediately, there does not appear to be any justification for that assault that young man who was laid motionless on the ground was subjected to. Greater Manchester Police have said that their officers were violently assaulted prior to this, just before the incident took place. And that being the case, then those individuals that were responsible should be held to account for that. Equally, the officers present, all of them, each and every single one of them, need to justify exactly why they did what they did. The statement that Greater Manchester Police have put out actually is quite misleading, because what it implies is that those officers were justified in the actions that they took because they were at risk of having their firearms taken from them. And if that is the case, and that they were at risk of having their firearms taken from them, they need to justify at which point that they were at risk, because when you look at the footage, that certainly doesn't appear to be the case. You have two gentlemen there, one laying face down on the floor, and then you had another one in the background sitting on a chair with his hands behind his head, being very compliant. That same officer who stamped on the head of that male laying face down then went to approach the other guy and took him to the ground and also stamped and kicked him. So he needs to justify why he took the action that he took, and at which point was he at risk of having his firearms taken from him. There was a number of officers that were also surrounding that whole incident who didn't seem to take the same course of action, who there was lots of commotion going on. So let's see what they say. And I think actually Greater Manchester Police have said that they will investigate this themselves. Totally and utterly unacceptable. This needs to go independently to the Office of Police Conduct.
Yeah, I mean, Shabnam, you have already alluded to this, but there is a sense, and I have no doubt that people listening to this will, for some, this will be the first thought in their mind, that what we're seeing is a fairly short video clip of what's happening, and that doesn't show any of the context, the situation that came before it or what came after. How helpful is it when these sorts of videos go viral?
I think we have to be realistic about this particular video. Look at the video, put it into some form of human context and ask yourself the question. And the police officer needs to also ask themselves the same question. Was I justified in the action that I took? Was I at risk of having my firearm removed from me? Were there other people around me at risk of being seriously assaulted by those individuals that were laying face down on the floor? What was the actions of those individuals just before they laid down on the floor that caused the officer, the particular officer, to take the course of action that he did? I understand why the public are really, really concerned about this. You're at the Greater Manchester Airport, and I'm not sure if it's an international one or not, but you've got thousands of members of the public coming from all over the world that walk into that airport that will expect to be treated with some form of dignity and respect by the police and by anybody that works in those environments. And the only other thing I'd say is any emergency officer or worker that is subjected to any form of violence those individuals that are responsible should be brought to justice for it. But that does not mean to say, and I'm not saying that's the case in this one, but that does not mean to say that you see red mist and that you brutally violate somebody else's right and take the law into your own hands. These are the questions those officers will need to answer.
Well, Greater Manchester Police has said the footage is being reviewed by its professional standards branch. Does that go far enough?
Absolutely not. No, I'm sorry. I think that you've got to look at the public interest in this particular matter, and you've got to look at the public concern, trust and confidence, which is rock bottom across policing across the UK. To mark your own homework in an incident like this is not acceptable. Those officers need to be held to account, quite rightly, and those who subjected those officers also to violence also need to be held to account. This needs to be independently investigated by the IOPC.
A female police officer, we understand, has suffered a broken nose in this altercation. Greater Manchester Police says that all three of the officers involved were taken to hospital for treatment. It is a particularly stressful job, and I'd imagine, Shabnam, that working in airports a particularly stressful environment. Is that stress any sort of, I mean, not an excuse for what we've seen in this video, but perhaps an explanation in part?
Police officers work hard every day, many of them, thousands of them, and they take risks every day of their lives. And those officers who have been assaulted, I hope that they all recover fully. There is no justification for seeing red mist or for taking a course of action which results in the injury of a member of the public who's been subjected to an arrest. I'm not saying again that this has happened, but potentially, if you think that my colleagues have been injured and therefore that justifies me to take a certain course of action, you're in the wrong job. These are officers that carry firearms. These are elite, specially trained officers who deal with these type of incidents day in, day out.
I was going to ask if it's all the more significant that we're seeing firearms officers here.
Well, I think it's quite normal to have firearms officers at airports. Now, whether they were local officers that were called into the airport, I don't know, or whether it was those officers at the airport that were called to the incident. I just read something on social media about somebody spoken to members of the family. The young man that was laid on the floor has sustained injuries, which doesn't come as any surprise. Sorry, there was some form of abuse targeted towards the older lady that was there, either the mother or the aunt or relative. So that obviously all needs to be investigated. But I think it's quite normal to have firearms. I see them all the time at any airport I've ever been to. Firearms officers patrolling those particular airports.
I wondered more so that we are seeing firearms officers in this case clearly losing control, and you'd hope that the sort of officer that would get to the level that they are able to hold a firearm would not, as you put it, see red mist. Can I just ask for your thoughts on something I'm seeing being shared on social media, and that is of the man having his head stamped on and being kicked by a police officer in this video being of Pakistani descent. Is that significant? Is that worth talking about?
I think it's definitely worth talking about. I think the general public will see that as something that's been worth talked about. I think, unfortunately, people from Black, minority, Asian communities are definitely treated differently by police officers. Again, I'm not saying that's the case in this incident, but I can totally understand why the members of the public would feel that this has been a targeted attack on an individual for whatever reason, and race will definitely play a part in that.
Shabnam Chowdhury, really good speaking to you, former Met Police Detective Superintendent, reflecting on that shocking footage that is being shared widely on social media, with Greater Manchester Police investigating the footage of an armed police officer kicking and stamping on a man.
Officers are human. And I would like people to just actually imagine themselves in that position, having gone through that, having had 3 police officers have to attend to hospital, one with a broken nose, having a fight with 3 large guys, having to grapple them, and you've got a weapon on your side. I've had to grapple with someone with a weapon on my side. It's not a nice experience, because I realise that suddenly you are at their disposal and you cannot allow them. And I'll tell you now, if somebody actually gets your weapon and tries to pull it away from you, then there is reasonable force would be to shoot them, because you have reasonable thoughts to actually.
A video has gone viral online appearing to show a police officer Kicking and stamping on the head of a man lying on the ground at Manchester Airport. The officer is seen holding a taser over the man who's lying face down before striking him twice. Greater Manchester Police said that firearms officers had been attacked while attempting to arrest somebody following a fight at the airport's Terminal 2 yesterday. Let's speak to Harry Tanguy, who is a former armed response police officer and author of Firearms and Fatals. Harry, good evening. You have seen the video. What do you make of it?
Yes. Well, initially, I'm just very suspicious. Why does it start? The one I've seen is it starts right on the foot swinging. And the initial thoughts are, oh, well, was that entirely necessary? And then you have to think, actually, these armed officers have just been trying to arrest very large men who have resisted arrest. They've grappled with them. They know they've already put 3 police officers to require hospital treatment, 1 female officer with a broken nose, and they're grappling. Now, if any of those individuals get hold of that gun,
right,
then God knows what would happen. Quite frankly, the officers cannot allow them to do that. And if you grapple with a firearms officer, let me tell you now, you'll either end up very bruised or very dead. With regards to the actual kick, I would like to know what happened before that.
Okay,
I'm very suspicious of the edited footage.
I must say, I'm looking at a video here, which is 43 seconds. The first, it is about 2 seconds before the first foot strikes, and the man does appear to be on the ground. His head is actually facing away from the officer. He does turn his head to look towards the officer, but he does appear to be restrained. He's lying on the ground. His hands are down by his side, and that is the point at which the officer strikes. Now, of course, there'll be an investigation, and you're right, context is really important. But I think it's just worth me saying that it does appear to I've got a couple of extra seconds perhaps than you saw on the video, and the gentleman does appear to be restrained.
Okay, and so just say you're quite right, there'll be an investigation, and quite rightly. I hope what will be taken into consideration if it is found that that officer has lashed out like that, and just say, because I would love to see all the information, the evidence first of all, but okay, let's go with that. Then I would hope that taking into consideration the adrenaline pumping around those officers, knowing that their lives could be taken, or other members of the public in that area, because once that weapon has gone, God knows what's going to happen. So I think public have got to realise that when an individual such as a police officer is dealing with that situation, they are going to be pumped. It's going to be flight or fight, and they are fighting at that moment. And if it's the fact that an officer has acted overzealously or whatever, I hope it's taken into consideration that there is enormous amounts of adrenaline pumping through that individual.
But your job as a police officer in that moment, though, Harry, particularly as an armed one, presumably, is to show a level of restraint, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it is. But officers are human. And I would like people to just actually imagine themselves in that position, having gone through that, having had 3 police officers have to attend hospital, 1 with a broken nose, having a fight with 3 large guys, having to grapple them, and you've got a weapon on your side. I've had to grapple with someone with a weapon on my side. It's not a nice experience, because I realise that suddenly you are at their disposal and you cannot allow them. And I'll tell you now, if somebody actually gets your weapon and tries to pull it away from you, then there is reasonable force would be to shoot them, because you have reasonable thoughts to actually.
Okay.
The fact that he's on the ground, and as he's saying, I'll concede to you that on initial thoughts it doesn't look good. So I'd like to see the rest of the footage, but I'd also like for people just to consider for a second that their body is pumping with adrenaline, and sometimes policing doesn't look very pretty. And yes, if there's things can be learned, and if there's even looking at that, I doubt that there's particularly injuries, so I don't think it's huge force involved. And whether it shouldn't have been happening, they decide that, they can deal with that. But I hope it's appropriately.
Just very briefly, how does that process work then, Harry? What happens now?
Well, the force, whenever there's something that will attract public attention, then the force tends to volunteer that it goes to the IOPC and that they would have a look at it. The IOPC then will look at it and say, no, actually, this is the force. The force can look at it. Their professional standards unit, they can look at it as that level. We're happy that things were as they were. If they think it's more serious and there could be charges involved, then it goes to the IOPC, and then we'll get the result in about 5 years' time, shall we?
Right. Okay. Fine. Okay. That's something for us to look forward to. Harry, thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. Harry Tanguy, who is a former former firearms officer, former armed response police officer, and author of Firearms and Fatals. Let me just remind you of what Greater Manchester Police had to say. They said that while attempting to arrest one of the subjects of an earlier altercation, 3 officers were subjected to a violent assault where they were punched to the ground. A female officer suffered a broken nose. There was a clear risk during the assault to their firearms, of their firearms being taken from them. 4 men were arrested at the scene for a fray and assault on an emergency service workers. We acknowledge the concerns of the conduct within the video, and our Professional Standards Directorate are assessing this.
Instant reaction was at least one officer needs to be immediately suspended from duty on the basis that his actions have undermined public confidence in the service, and an immediate start for a criminal investigation into an offence of assault, probably assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and an immediate referral to the Independent Office for Police Conduct.
Yes, we've got an update on that incident we were discussing earlier at Manchester Airport. A Greater Manchester police officer has been suspended from all duties after that video emerged showing a man being kicked as he lay on the floor at Manchester Airport. A spokesperson for the force says a referral's now been made to the Independent Office for Police Conduct for a full independent investigation. We understand the deep concerns that have been widely raised with us, and will continue to meet and discuss these feelings with Greater Manchester residents and elected representatives while this independent investigation takes place.
If you've not seen the video, it is disgusting. And we had a police officer, a former anti-terrorism police officer, who said what this behaviour was had nothing to do with police training. There's a guy on the floor, already been tasered, potentially even tasered twice, and he gets kicked in the head. And he gets kicked in the head with some disgraceful force. Have a look at it, see what you think of it. You can see the video on the Times website.
Let's return to that. This the unfolding story, which has been developing all morning. A police officer has been suspended after a video emerged showing a suspect being kicked in the head as he lay on the floor at Manchester Airport. Constance Kampner, the Times' northern correspondent, and has got the latest. Bring us up to date, Constance. What's happened? What's happened this morning?
Yeah, so the video, which is really quite shocking, obviously understandably provoked a strong reaction, and there were protests last night outside Rochdale Police Station, a couple of hundred people, and it all passed peacefully, but it is understood that the 2 men in the video are Asian, and so there's been allegations of systemic racism at the hands of the police. Greater Manchester Police has now suspended the officer in the video and has voluntarily referred itself to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. There have also been 4 arrests, and they said that the whole thing began because firearms officers had been subjected to a violent assault while trying to arrest a person after a fight at Manchester Airport on Tuesday.
And there have been reactions to this protest outside a police station in Rochdale.
Yes, indeed. And we now understand that the 2 men have sort of lawyered up and are planning on complaining, putting forward a formal complaint to Greater Manchester Police.
Thanks for that, Constance. Constance Camphor there with the update on the situation there in Rochdale. Paul Ward, the Labour MP for Rochdale, said the footage was truly shocking and disturbing. He was extremely concerned. And Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, said he'd seen the disturbing video footage which was circulated and recognised the widespread and deep concern this has caused in Greater Manchester and beyond. Elsewhere, a Greater Manchester police officer has been suspended after a video appeared to show him kicking a man and stamping on his head as he lay on the floor at the city's airport. The incident sparked a protest outside Rochdale Police Station last night. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has appealed for calm. Well, Stephen Roberts is the former Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and was its Director of Professional Standards, and joins me now. Stephen, it's a very short video. We don't know the context of what happened before or afterwards, but what went through your mind when you first saw the clip?
It's shocking behaviour on the part of at least one officer and possibly more. And it's very hard to imagine any possible justification, legal justification, for what was done there. So my instant reaction was at least one officer needs to be immediately suspended from duty on the basis that his actions have undermined public confidence in the service, and an immediate start for a criminal investigation into an offence of assault, probably assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and an immediate referral to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Had that happened, it might just have averted the demonstration, might just have calmed down public opinion a bit better than what seems now to have happened, where the officer has been suspended eventually sometime later.
And what are the rules in terms of the force that you are able to use? There are clearly some situations, and there's a suggestion that before this happened, 3 police officers have been assaulted, including a female officer who had suffered a broken nose. What are the rules about the acceptable? I mean, clearly there's a difference between kicking someone in the head and other sorts of force, but what are the rules about what force is able to be used by an officer?
Officers are able, and indeed this is their duty, to use lawful force in order to protect both themselves and members of the public. But that force must be proportionate to the events, proportionate to the risk, and it must be force that's reasonable in all the circumstances. Now, there's been something made of the fact that there have been serious assaults on some of those officers prior to the video clip. But I'm afraid retaliation is absolutely no excuse whatsoever. This appears to be a person on the ground, not fighting, not presenting a risk to the officers or to anybody else. So it is difficult to see how it could conceivably be lawful.
There's also, I mean, the element, and we've seen this obviously an awful lot these days. Everyone has got a camera in their pocket. There's clearly never a good time to kick the police officer kicking someone in the head, but just being in a public place like that, it's almost inevitable that it's going to be captured. And I just wonder whether you think that is that making policing harder? Is it holding more police to account? Just the fact that, in all these instances we saw with the riots last week in Leeds, everything these days is captured and it's being streamed in real time. It's not even waiting to be uploaded. It's being streamed in real time.
It's certainly making bad policing harder. My own view is rather like the body-worn cameras that almost all officers are carrying almost all the time now. Having an objective video and audio record of what's happened, A, should protect officers from malicious allegations, but B, should force officers to think twice about what they're doing, to think about not letting anger lead to unlawful retaliation.
It's really interesting, that. Stephen, really good to speak to you. Stephen Roberts, the former Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Metropolitan Police and former Director of Professional Standards at the Force. Greater Manchester Police has said this morning, after a thorough review of the situation, they have suspended that police officer from all duties, and a referral has now been made to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, as Stephen was just discussing there. It goes on to say, we understand the deep concerns have been widely raised with us and will continue to meet and discuss those feelings with Greater Manchester residents and elected representatives while this independent investigation takes place. More on that as and when there are.
I just wonder what would have happened if this had been a white family. All the officers in the firearms unit were white, and I think firearms units across the country remain stubbornly white. I was a firearms commander. I'd often turn up and give a briefing. I'd be the only person of colour in the room. And all the people who were arrested and pushed and shoved, and those who weren't arrested, were from a Pakistani heritage. So I think you have to explore the issues around racism and whether that was excessive force. There was nobody there, no police officer there trying to de-escalate the situation. It just seemed to be a one-way traffic in terms of aggression. And so it's very troubling and very worrying. The fact that the officer has been now suspended, the officer should have been suspended immediately. It didn't take a rocket science to look at that video and think, well, that's excessive force.
It's exactly 2:15, so an armed police officer has been suspended after a video of a man being kicked and stamped on the head at Manchester Airport has been widely shared on social media. Protesters gathered outside Rochdale Police Station last night to chant, GMP, shame on you. The force has referred itself to the policing watchdog for investigation.
Stop kicking people! Move back, stay!
It's a deeply distressing video if you have watched it. There is a man lying on the ground and he has his arms behind him and the police officer is holding a taser but then does stamp on his head. There is a woman by the side of the man who then tries to push the officer away and she is pushed too. We can talk to Dal Babu, former superintendent at the Met Police. A very good afternoon to you. How did you feel when you watched the video?
Well, I think it's pretty disturbing. It was sent to me by numerous people over the last couple of days. I think police clearly can use force when they're carrying out their duty, but it has to be proportionate and reasonable. I think striking a man who's lying in a prone position, head down, arms behind his back, kicking him in the face and then stamping on his head is, in anybody's view, excessive.
Yeah.
The same officer then goes to another man who's got his hands up in the air in a sort of defensive method, and he pulls him down, kicks him in the leg, and strikes him on the back of the head with a taser gun.
I mean,
so this is an officer who just used far too much force than was necessary.
What are the guidelines for arrest when a suspect might be physically attacking an officer, though, because this is the defence offered by the GMP? I mean, how soon should a taser be used in that situation?
Well, what we saw is the officer can use, he or she can use proportionate and reasonable force. So I've had guns pulled on me, knives pulled on me, you use your baton, you kick, punch. That's all reasonable in those circumstances. But the video we saw was a man lying prone down, face down, hands behind his back, and he was then kicked in the head and stamped on. I think that is excessive force.
Yeah, I mean, it is deeply, deeply distressing and disturbing to watch. Later in the video, a woman trying to calm the situation, she's pushed away by one of the police officers too. And you, I would imagine from what you've said, have some sympathy with why this would aggravate a situation between communities and the police. But I know also that you feel that there might be a racist element to this. Can you explain what that is in your view?
Well, I just wonder what would have happened if this had been a white family. All the officers in the firearms unit were white. And I think firearms units across the country are remain stubbornly white. I was a firearms commander. I'd often turn up and give a briefing. I'd be the only person of colour in the room. And all the people who were arrested and pushed and shoved, and those who weren't arrested, were from a Pakistani heritage. So I think you have to explore the issues around racism and whether that was excessive force. There was nobody there, no police officer there trying to de-escalate the situation. It just seemed to be a one-way traffic in terms of aggression. And so it's very troubling and very worrying. The fact that the officer has been now suspended, the officer should have been suspended immediately. It didn't take a rocket science to look at that video and think, well, that's excessive force.
Yep. I mean, it is worth noting, isn't it, that the woman in the video, she is the one who does appear to be trying to de-escalate the situation. And she is also physically pushed away, isn't she?
Yeah, she's pushed by a couple of officers, shoved. She was lucky she didn't fall and injure herself. And you can see people saying, Auntie G, please stay back, stay back. They're trying to protect her. So, I think, if you look at the entire video and you look at other clips that have been released, it just shows a excessive use of force by Greater Manchester Police. There seems to be a groupthink. And remember, this is not an anti-police family. They have relatives in the police. They are sort of they were pro-police as a family. So they have relatives in the police who are quite supportive of GMP, but I should imagine they might reassess their situation after this particular incident.
Gosh, well, those are details that we didn't know, actually, so thank you for relaying that. What does happen when a force refers itself to the policing watchdog for investigation? It's a sentence that I've read out several times on air. I'm sure my colleague Jane has read it out too. What does it actually mean, though?
Well, Fee, the Independent Office of Police Conduct will review the conduct of Greater Manchester Police. It will be done independently from Greater Manchester Police, and they will make a decision about the actions of the police, essentially from cradle to grave, from when police were first called to this incident I understand there were allegations that racist language slurs had been used against this family. I understand when police arrived, there was an attempt to arrest, and that's when police officers were injured, when there was an attempt to arrest. And then we have the situation which has been the focus of public attention, is where this man is lying prone on the floor, face down, doesn't appear to be presenting any threat, and the police officer decides to kick him in the head and stamp on his head.
So
I
how-
think, I can imagine that will be the focus.
Sure. How much should we take into account those other factors that you've mentioned? The force that had been used by, apparently, by these two men that the police were trying to arrest. So, police officers had to go to hospital. One police officer had her nose broken during that incident. I mean, that's the stuff that we don't see on the video, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So we haven't got the full story, but the reality is the focus has been the police officer kicking. So lots of situations happen where you go to a punch up, and you end up having to deal with some very, very difficult situations, but you can't let the red mist come down. You particularly if you're carrying a firearm. The police officer who kicked the man in the head and stamped on his head was carrying a firearm. You want people to be of calm disposure, and having somebody who does that doesn't bode well in terms of who Greater
Sure.
Manchester Police are selecting for carrying firearms.
So would you always separate what has led up to an incident, though? Wouldn't it be entirely fair for some people to expect that you have to take in what the police officers had been facing before it came to what they then did?
No, I don't think it'd be appropriate to do that. If that was the case, then every time a police officer gets assaulted, he might want to have a dig at the person who's done it. That's not acceptable. So the fact that you've got an incident where police officers have been injured in an issue, they've detained the individuals. Then
Right.
it's not a matter for the police to then mete out their own summary justice. It's important that those people are arrested, put before the Crown Prosecution Service, and the courts make a decision. So I think it's very, very important to separate the two issues that occurred. And I don't know. All I know is that police officers were injured. I don't know the circumstances of that, but I think that once the person has been detained, then you have a duty as a police officer to arrest them and place them before the CPS for advice on whether it's a charge or not.
Right. Do you believe that if GMP had acted quicker in the suspension of this officer and been proactive when this video footage was doing the rounds on social media in explaining the situation, offering an apology, talking about suspension, if they had done that in the moment, do you think that that would be enough? I mean, I think a lot of people listening think that kind of criticism of the time delay is almost irrelevant. I mean, what we see is what we see, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the GMP were very slow in coming forward in sort of dealing with this issue. I think, ironically, there's only a handful of Asian senior officers. You can count them on one hand in GMP. They put up an Asian officer to be the front person, not the chief constable, Steve Watson. So I think people could see through that. They saw it as an attempt to manage the community and the media. But the Greater Manchester Police should have been up front. They should have realised what the potential repercussions of this video would be, and if they dealt with it in the way you're describing, Fee, I think this perhaps wouldn't have been the story it is now.
Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. That's Del Babu, former superintendent at the Metropolitan Police. Any thoughts on that? Do be in touch with us this afternoon. It's 0333 003 2353. It is worth noting that Andy Burnham did immediately say, look, there is bound to be more to this than those images that you're seeing circulate.
Joining me now is the former firearms officer, Harry Tanguy. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Kate. How are you?
Very well. Look, as we try and understand this story a little better, and there are gaps to fill, and there is an investigation underway, of course, from your initial perspective, what sort of action would lead a police officer to, for a man who is pinned down already, kick and stamp that person in the head?
I would say probably hearing your colleagues screaming on the radio when you press the emergency button, it automatically stays on. and you can hear the person that you're having to deal with, the suspect, and your own shouts and screams, if that's the case. So I would well imagine that they've heard the female officer being punched or kicked in the face, broken nose, 2 other colleagues on the ground, and hospitalized to the extent. And this is a big step now. You don't fight armed officers, and as an armed officer, I would feel extremely exposed. I was only at one point was I on the ground grappling with someone, and I had a gun on me. And that's where you're sort of losing control, and it's almost as if they can do anything at that point. You are in imminent danger because you don't know who they are and you don't know what their intention is, or whether they've just lost it and they're just going to shoot you or one of our family that is walking by trying to go to on holiday. Now, as you say, we don't know what the circumstances of the footage I've seen starts about half a second before the foot strikes. I'm suspicious at that. I'd also like to see exactly what happened with the body-worn footage, and it'll all come to light. It's almost frustrating it doesn't come to light now, doesn't it? Like in America, so we can build a more wholesome picture, really, of the whole thing. Yes, it will surprise a few people. If you think there's huge amounts of adrenaline that are going in because they were big men. If you look on the video, they're quite big, they're tall, and they're resisting. And when I say resisting, some people think that means fighting. No, they were resisting. It's like I've been in that situation. They hunch their shoulders, strengthen their arms, and it's sort of that come and get me. I'm not coming quietly. And those officers, myself included, would know that, well, this is going to end up in a bundle, and I don't want to do that with a gun. Yes, they're on the ground, his hands are free. I don't know what's being said before, and we see the incident occurring. And I really don't want to comment on that at the moment until it's all over, because too many times people have commented and then regretted what they've said.
And we, really appreciate your expertise on this, Harry. Is it protocol to kick and stamp a person on the head if they are on the ground? If they're not confronting you, if they're in a position face down on the ground, would that normally be appropriate action?
No, there's no protocol to do that, but there's Home Office approved techniques. But at the end of the day, if you're feeling that you or somebody else is in danger, you may use reasonable force, and that may be lethal, of course. It's whether that individual has seen a little bit of red mist or not, we don't know yet. What I must say, though, is with armed response in particular, you have to show so that you can almost frighten them away from trying to attack you and get your gun off you, because if you're evenly matched, you're underrepresented, because your whole one hand's on your gun while you're fending people off or trying to arrest them. So you need to dominate, and that means aggressive, that means shouting, that means being quite rough with someone, pulling them onto the ground, domination. And because the result of that is not to have a good old bully session like someone might think. The result of that is because the end result is far less damaging than if you go in very softly and they end up having a fight with you and then a gun goes off. A little bit like the CS spray. It was a CS spray or the pepper spray, and then they grabbed the guy to pull him down. You can do it a distraction technique, and that might be a punch or a slap to distract them so that you can actually get the upper hand, and that avoids people getting seriously injured or killed. And with your report earlier about this cyst, no one's actually said whether this. I mean, I did a quick Google, so I'm not an expert. No one said if it's a cyst from previously that has been discovered due to a CT scan, or whether, because I don't think cysts are caused immediately. So that would be nice to get clarification on that. And I don't know if he's been particularly vague on that. I would like to say, sorry, Karen.
Well, it isn't conclusive. We know that doctors say, or their lawyer reports, that doctors say that the man has a cyst on his brain and that it is getting worse. But absolutely, we can't make that correlation. We can't be absolutely certain that the kicking and stamping on his head was the cause of the cyst on the brain. Absolutely fine. to point that out. And I understand what you're saying about the fact that because that is a firearms officer, they are carrying a weapon. And so they sort of have to be even more assertive because they're carrying something dangerous. I mean, I've got lots of people, struggling with this as well. Harry, saying that the guy had his hands held. I mean, someone's written here, hands behind his head. I can't remember from seeing the footage whether the hands are behind the back or behind the head. Okay, yeah. The hands are by his side. But I think people struggle with the image of this, Harry, because the man appears to be already restrained.
Can I give you another side of this?
Yeah, go on.
So I'm
not
saying should he have done that or should he have not. All right, I'm not going to say that because I'm not qualified. Otherwise, what's the point of an IOPC investigation? But what I'm saying is, as a police officer for 30 years, you're undermined. If you want to make your 30 years, you're being undermined, you're being baited, you're being attacked, you're being assaulted. You've just seen your female colleague. If you think of someone very close to you work with, and I'm sorry, female, it does make it worse. If a grown man punches her or kicks her in the face and she's got broken her nose, for a woman, it's quite horrendous. And then you're having to grapple with these people, and then you're thinking, well, this could carry on. The adrenaline is going to be up. And unfortunately, with everybody else, if everybody else messes up or makes a mistake or overreacts slightly, because I would very much doubt the results that are being shouted about because they're being particularly vague about it. And if they were, he also says.
But it's
that the police
appropriateness of action, isn't it, Harry? Sorry to interject. And there'll be people screaming at the radio now, surely if you're a firearms officer, you are absolutely acutely trained to deal with a situation under stress, particularly because you are carrying a firearm. So that if your female colleague does suffer from a broken nose, that should not impede your judgment, should it?
No, and 99.9% of the time it doesn't. But when you're dealing with human beings, and that's why I hope this will be dealt with proportionately, and that we're not going to run away with this situation where some behaviour by some men that put 3 police officers in hospital suddenly doesn't matter anymore. That these 3 police officers are suddenly, they're so irrelevant. The people who punched them and put them in hospital are now considered victims. And now there's protests up saying how these poor people are being dealt with. I'm sure there's more community that are upset about their actions in the first place.
And look, I want to point out we don't absolutely for sure know who was involved in the incident against the police officers. We don't know which of the men, if any of the men, that is the presumption that there has to be a reason why they're being apprehended by police. But again, we haven't got the full picture here. And I do understand what you're saying about seeing that incredibly, harsh incident, the incident of the stamping, seeing that alone does not give you all of the context. And that is, I suppose, what the police and the police watchdog need to be working out now. But I don't understand what possible justification could be put forward for stamping on somebody's head when they're on the floor. It just beggars belief. But then it's this debate that then has sort of come out of it, and actually, potentially irresponsible debate as well, which will just stoke up tensions that perhaps don't need to be stoked when the incident itself should speak for itself and should be dealt with appropriately.
To have you with us here on Pinar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company, which tonight is the highly esteemed political strategist and advisor Joe Tanner. Hello, Joe, lovely to see you. And Theo Usherwood, of course, is back with us. Hello, Theo. Let me ask you first, Joe, what's your thought for the day?
My thought for the day is blood. Give blood. There is a big shortage.
I thought you were talking about Donald Trump for a second.
No, not quite. We've moved on from that. My mum actually had her operation at King's College Hospital cancelled a few weeks back when there was that cyber attack on the blood supply or testing facility. And basically they've said now that has contributed towards this shortage that we've now got of O and O negative. So I plead because my mum's operation has finally just been rescheduled for August. So I'm really hoping that they'll get the blood supplies back up in time.
Well, best wishes to your mum as well. And Thea, what's your thought for the day?
I know we're going to be discussing it, but I was looking at, and it's great that Joe's here actually, because I'd be interested in her thoughts on it. But I'm just astounded. I know people are looking at this video footage from Manchester, but the thing that's really struck me, perhaps more than the video footage, are the statements, the first statement in particular, and the way that it just seems to be the police getting in their excuses. And it talks about a referral to professional standards, i.e. the internal investigation, rather than the IOPC, which of course is the external body that investigates complaints against the police. And I would have thought that had Greater Manchester Police looked at this, and I cannot understand for the life of me why they haven't done it, looked at what had happened in that video, why they wouldn't immediately refer it for an external investigation. Because if you wanted to portray this was a mistake, that this was a quote-unquote bad apple, a rogue police officer acting in a way, and I heard the statement from the very senior officer this morning on Times Radio that this was something that he didn't recognise, then why on earth didn't the statement reflect that in the first instance? And it seems to be that they have been dragged kicking and screaming to the position where the Greater Manchester Police have seen what everybody else has seen about this whole incident and how terrible and how appalling it is. And I don't quite understand why in 2024 we have a police force, one of the largest police forces in the country, which is behaving or thinks that isn't, the first response was an adequate response.
Okay, but if it is, as you described, as a pretty slow realisation, I do want to pick up on those themes precisely because that is the story which is just grabbing so much attention today. I'm just going to recap on it. We know the now viral video depicts an officer kicking an individual while he was lying head down on the floor at Manchester Airport. That officer has been suspended. We know that. The Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, he gave this reaction.
It's a very disturbing image and hard to justify. But of course, I've had the opportunity now to see the full situation as it escalates, and it does escalate very rapidly, and there are issues on both sides. You can't say that the whole situation is clear cut because of the way it unfolds. But then I don't resile from what I originally said. Even though I've seen all of the build-up, it's still a disturbing image, and it's right, therefore, that the matter has been referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, that an individual has been suspended, and there will now be a full investigation.
That's Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, striking a judicial tone. Now, this afternoon, Ahmed Yaqub, who's the legal representative of the individual seen being kicked in that video, he spoke to press outside Rochdale Police Station.
It was something that hasn't been seen before, such police brutality. And I could tell you guys now that the people who were assaulted by the police are members of a police officer's family who is currently serving in the Greater Manchester Police Force. This man is now afraid to go to work. He went in today and spoke to his supervisor, and the only reason he is not going to work because he is fearing for his own safety, and he thinks, like his family members were the victims, he could be a victim.
Well, that's the lawyer of the man who was seen being kicked in that video. Now, earlier, I spoke to the former Scotland Yard Superintendent, Nusrit Mehtab, and asked if, in her view, Greater Manchester Police could be trusted to deal with this incident properly.
No.
You do not?
No, and I'll explain why. Let's have a look at what's come through in the last week regarding Greater Manchester Police. The Vera Baird report and the fact that they make, the unlawful arrests are endemic, and the fact that 7 officers have already been suspended for extreme racism.
So, what do you make of this, guys? I mean, first of all, Joe, we wouldn't be having this conversation in anything like this sort of way if it wasn't for social media. But social media is part of the world in which we live. It's part of the environment surrounding any sort of incident of this kind. Now, what do you make of it?
Well, it's where social media sort of has its positives and its negatives, because ultimately there's a lot of footage out there which, to the very point made earlier about the statement that was made and how quickly these things can almost be not necessarily closed down, but even covered up. The fact that there is footage widely available means that people can see this incident from more than one angle. They can make their own mind up about what went on. The problem is that is also dangerous, because then what happens is there's this huge debate and quite frankly, often ill-informed comments that appear, and we've actually also seen those come from members of the House of Parliament as well. So there is a real risk that this thing sort of becomes something that it perhaps wasn't. It's an incident in an airport, doesn't appear to have been handled particularly well, just in terms of it looks like a very chaotic scene. I don't understand what possible justification could be put forward for stamping on somebody's head when they're on the floor. It just beggars belief. But then it's this debate that then has sort of come out of it, and actually, potentially irresponsible debate as well, which will just stoke up tensions that perhaps don't need to be stoked when the incident itself should speak for itself and should be dealt with appropriately.
It's inevitable, as it is unavoidable now that this has now been sucked into the old culture war.
Yeah, and the fact that one of the relatives, the brother of the victim, who's now they've just found apparently a sort of cyst on his brain through some scan that's taken place, is actually a serving police officer in the force. I mean, that's a hell of a curveball to have thrown into this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, let me just read this to you. It's our listener, Duncan, who writes in from Taunton. Thank you, Duncan. Duncan says, my daughter's about to join the police, and I'm quietly frightened about it. Her boyfriend, who's been in the police for just over a year, has already been stabbed. We all sit in our armchairs judging the actions of others. Perhaps we ought to exchange places with them for a spell, although this particular individual seems to have used excessive force, but we need to see the whole incident. That's Duncan's contribution in Taunton, who's written in. Again, thank you, Duncan. I want to add this. Farward in Walthamstow in London has said a head stomp on a man already subdued is someone out of control. An armed officer should not be out of control. I mean, at all points, we've seen the video. The reaction is inevitable. The row and the political controversial, absolutely predictable. But there is an investigation in train. I don't want to go too far down the point of judging this particular case in detail and pointing final fingers of blame.
We have to remember that there are plenty of good officers and other public servants, whether they're paramedics, whether they are people that drive those ambulances, whether they are people that work in sort of prominent roles where they deal with the public, who actually do suffer violence, often unprovoked, on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Which also, there are good stats out there that you can find out. The problem with this is, we are aware that there were other officers that were injured, but it still beggars the question of, can you simply justify then that because a couple of people were injured that you then stamp on somebody when they're laying on the floor? It just doesn't make any sense.
I think part of the problem is that I heard that response there from Andy Burnham, is I think it needs. We've seen the response from Richard Tice from Reform, where he made this comparison that somehow this was the sort of policing we wanted to see, and if we'd seen this in Leeds, then we wouldn't have had what happened in Leeds with the riots in Leeds, and actually this was something that the British public should sign up to. So to your point about the culture wars, we not only have now an incredibly fast-paced social media situation where these things accelerate beyond what would have ever happened 10 years ago, but we've also got a political climate where we have 5 members of Parliament in Reform UK who are there elected by the British public in their respective seats, but have latched onto this very quickly with some quite incendiary language. And I think that can create quite a toxic mix quite quickly. And I would have expected I would have thought that the best way to deal with that and to combat that, whether you're the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police or the Director of Communications of Greater Manchester Police or the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, in effect the Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester Police, is to act quite swiftly, not to prejudge what's happened, because of course that footage is only a snapshot of events, but it is in an airport, so there will be CCTV as well, but to move quite quickly to get this referred over to the IOPC, to suspend the officers concerned. You can suspend them on full pay, and then that would allow a full and in-depth investigation to take place as quickly as possible to get to the bottom of what has happened. But also on the other side, there are many good police officers who would never countenance using violence like that. And it's an incredibly difficult job being a police officer, as it is being a paramedic or being a firefighter. They are regularly subject to abuse. I've done campaigns on it when in a previous working life. It is incredibly difficult. But I think if you can actually act much more swiftly and dampen things and give the community the reassurance that you are taking it seriously, then it's actually possible to dampen things down a bit and get some control in the situation.
It is a pity and a shame that we even have to ask the question: will Greater Manchester Police be trusted to have a proper independent look at this thing and to deal with it appropriately? Because in the climate that we are in, with so many cases where police have cast doubt on the ability of themselves and their colleagues and their senior officers and their forces to be open and frank and honest in confronting their problems, that's always going to be one of the first questions.
And I think that is a suspicion of the public. The one thing I would say that I think is and maybe I'm being very bold in saying this, but I think there is one individual involved in this that I think will make sure that the truth comes out, and that is Andy Burnham himself. If ever there was a crusader for getting to the bottom of what on earth has gone on when you look at Hillsborough, when you look at what happened with the Manchester bombing, that is a man who tends to get an issue and drives it until the truth comes out. And I think I would count on him to stand up and actually ensure that ultimately for the sort of the long-term future of his city, he needs to ensure that this is dealt with properly, because otherwise it will cause significant problems for that community.
Okay, I'm going to just read out this statement from Greater Manchester Police. It says, following a thorough review of further information that's become available in relation to an incident at Manchester Airport on Tuesday evening, Greater Manchester Police has suspended a police officer from all duties. A referral has been made to the Independent Office for Police Conduct for a full independent investigation. Then it says, we understand the deep concerns that have been widely raised with us and will continue to meet and discuss these feelings with Greater Manchester residents and elected representatives while this independent investigation takes place. We will be watching the progress of all of that.
It came up then that, a lot of these officers who are being investigated are still serving, and it does raise questions about, whether there is a kind of wider cultural problem at GMP. I spoke today to the author of that report, Dame Vera Baird, and she told me, that same sense of entitlement that she'd talked about in that report and that she'd seen in terms of the treatment of these female detainees was the same kind of entitlement that she fears the officer involved in this incident was displaying in that quite horrific clip that many people have seen by now.
Let's start off with this, though, because it's an important story. The ongoing fallout from last night's incident, well, it was 2 nights ago, at Manchester Airport, in which a policeman appeared to be filmed kicking a man in the head whilst lying on the floor. And tonight, protesters have staged a demonstration outside the Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham's office with the lawyer of Muhammad Fahir Amzad saying his client has a cyst on his brain. It's been confirmed that an officer has been suspended, and the Greater Manchester Police has referred itself to the policing watchdog, the IOPC, for investigation. Andy Burnham gave his reaction earlier.
It's a very disturbing image and hard to justify. But of course, I've had the opportunity now to see the full situation as it escalates, and it does escalate very rapidly, and there are issues on both sides. You can't say that the whole situation is clear cut because of the way it unfolds. But then I don't resile from what I originally said. Even though I've seen all of the build-up, it's still a disturbing image, and it's right, therefore, that the matter has been referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, that an individual has been suspended, and there will now be a full investigation.
Okay, so that's Andy Burnham. Let's speak to Constance Kampfner, the Times Northern correspondent. Let's get the latest on this developing story. Hi, Constance.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Now, so we know there was a demonstration outside Rochdale police station last night. That was mainly the local Muslim community that gathered, I think mainly of Pakistani origin. But tonight, the focus moved to Manchester city centre and a much wider range of people, of demonstrators.
Yeah, that's right. Stand Up to Racism organised the demonstration tonight outside Andy Burnham's office. And as you say, it was a broader cast of people who had kind of been concerned by this video they'd seen online and wanted to come and express their outrage and their solidarity as well with the Pakistani community in Rochdale.
What were people calling for?
Well, they were calling for this officer who has now been suspended. Some of them were calling for him to face criminal charges. Now, we don't know whether or not those might be coming down the road, but they were upset that they felt that the police response had been somewhat to sort of try and brush this off at first before kind of releasing a much stronger statement, really condemning what had happened. But, people felt that that was too little too late and that there was kind of racism at the heart of this.
And how have people responded to Andy Burnham's appeals not to politicise this? I think he said at one point, I think it was Dal Babu, the former senior Met police officer, was irresponsible, or calls to say this was a racist incident were irresponsible. I'm wondering, did people refer to that? Have people started targeting the Greater Manchester Metro Mayor himself for what he said?
Not particularly on those comments. I think the the feeling at the demonstration was much more kind of about the police and the way this incident had been handled. And it's important to remember that the local MP who spoke to the family tonight said that they were also keen for this not to be politicised. Certainly not for any kind of violence in their name, or for this to kind of escalate in any kind of way other than peaceful protest. And that for them it's really about kind of getting to the bottom of what happened and ensuring justice is done.
Yeah, and as a number of people have been emphasising today, the brother of two of the men who've been arrested, including one who was kicked in the head, is a serving police officer with the GMP.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So the family's lawyer who came out to speak to the media outside Rochdale Police Station, that's the solicitor Ahmed Yaqub, who you might remember from when he was running to be an independent MP in Birmingham very recently. He said that the brother of the family, not one of the ones caught up in what happened in the airport, was an officer with the GMP and is now too afraid to go to work, that he fears that some of the treatment that his brothers received at the hands of his colleagues, essentially, could be kind of meted out to him, and that he has told his supervisor he won't be coming in.
And has the supervisor agreed to this? I mean, have the police put out a statement on this?
We haven't heard any more on that front. The family, I think, is kind of putting itself together before making any coordinated sort of public statements at this moment.
Yeah. And Constance, I'm just wondering what this might do to the reputation of the Greater Manchester Police, because they were once put in special measures, but their current chief constable, is it Steve Watson, he won widespread praise, including from the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, for his no-nonsense approach to policing. We're going to deal with every crime. How much pressure is he now under?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that GMP has kind of really improved in the last couple of years, and has admitted that it was in a very bad place. But, this comes just days after the force was criticised for its treatment of detainees, especially female detainees, in a report that found that officers were, and this is a quote, using their powers unwisely, unnecessarily, and sometimes unlawfully. Now, that was just a few days ago. The force and Stephen Watson apologised, said they were taking all of those recommendations on board. But it came up then that, a lot of these officers who are being investigated are still serving, and it does raise questions about, whether there is a kind of wider cultural problem at GMP. I spoke today to the author of that report, Dame Vera Baird, and she told me, that same sense of entitlement that she'd talked about in that report and that she'd seen in terms of the treatment of these female detainees was the same kind of entitlement that she fears the officer involved in this incident was displaying in that quite horrific clip that many people have seen by now.
It'll be interesting to see how the IOPC handles this, what they unearth, and what the full story is. Constance Kampfner, the Times' Northern correspondent, thank you very much.
Just here outside the police station, look at the cars and the people that have turned up in Rochdale to show support to the brothers and the mother who was attacked.
We stand in solidarity with all those who are oppressed around the world. Just in America, a woman with schizophrenia was shot dead. We hear the names, we remember the riots last time in London when the whole country came to a lockdown.
The initial video we saw was of a man being kicked in the head and stamped on, and then there's another case which involves pepper spray on a separate man, apparently the same officer, according to the IOPC.
Now in Manchester, hundreds of protesters last night blocked tram lines and roads in the city centre as anger continues over the incident at the city's airport. Well, video emerged on Wednesday which showed a man being kicked in the head and stamped on by a Greater Manchester police officer. Let's speak now to Joseph Timon, who's a reporter at the Manchester Evening News. Morning, Joseph.
Morning.
So just bring us the very latest on this investigation.
So the latest news we got last night was that the IOPC referred a second case within the same incident at the airport. It involves the same officer, but another man at the airport. So the initial video we saw was of a man being kicked in the head and stamped on, and then there's another case which involves pepper spray on a separate man, apparently the same officer according to the IOPC.
And the man's solicitor, the man who was on the ground, he's been speaking and talking about his condition.
Yeah, that's right. So he did a press conference yesterday in Rochdale, where the family are from, and in the press conference he said that doctors had found a cyst, a CT scan had identified a cyst on the brain. It's not clear, whether that was a direct result of the incident, but obviously, he went to hospital after the incident, and that's what they found. And he said that his medical condition had worsened. But just to be clear, I mean, it seems like from other videos that the solicitors put out that this man did not go straight to hospital. He went to the police station, and he was sort of pictured at home with the solicitor before the update came later saying that his medical condition had worsened.
And it's interesting because Andy Burnham, who is the Mayor of Greater Manchester, of course, has said that he doesn't want to see people politicise this, and suggesting maybe he's seen a bit more footage than we have seen.
Yeah, so what he would have seen is most likely to be sort of the body-worn cameras from the officers. So in his role as mayor, he's also police and crime commissioner. So he will have had a briefing from Greater Manchester Police quite early on, I assume, after this video started going viral. Obviously, there's quite a few videos out there, but the main video that people have seen is relatively short. And, I think whatever the context is, it's really worrying to see anything like that. It's hard to imagine anything that could have happened before that would justify sort of a man being on the floor, doesn't seem to be resisting, being treated like that. However, as Andy Burnham has said, the context might sort of change how people feel about it. It might not necessarily change the outcome. Obviously, that officer has been suspended anyway. So GMP obviously believe that there was grounds to do that.
Joseph, thank you for that. Joseph Timon there, reporter at the Manchester Evening News. Let's bring in Naila Ashraf, who is one of the organisers of the protests which were taking place in Manchester last night. She's also co-chair of the campaign group Greater Manchester Stand Up to Racism. Good morning.
Morning.
First of all, just give us a sense of what the mood was like amongst the protesters out last night.
I think clearly really quite horrified and angry at the video that they had seen. Whatever the context they like to talk about, the fact is that this individual was lying on the ground with his hands along the side, and he was firstly kicked in the face and then stamped on the head. And I think it's really important to say that if that person carrying out those actions wasn't wearing a police uniform, they would have been charged. They would have been arrested on the spot and there would have been an investigation. But that doesn't happen. Instead, what we're having is a whole host of politicians saying, we need to look at the context. Actually, I think there can never be any situation where it's acceptable for someone to behave in that manner, use that level of brutal force on another individual, whether they are members of the public or whether they are in uniform.
Is there a plan for further protests to take place? Just give us a sense of what you're moving towards and what would stop the protests.
I mean, obviously, there is a lot of anger and people were asking about when will the next protest be. And for us, it's very much looking at what will happen today, what will be the response from the authorities. We do want a full apology. We also want to see all of the individuals involved in the incident to be first lose their jobs and then to be investigated and have a legal criminal investigation carried out, because I don't think it's good enough. To be fair,
Naila, you're absolutely right that people would want to see justice done. That would take time, wouldn't it? There would need to be a thorough investigation.
I think it's really interesting. Can I just say, I think that's really interesting. We hear that so often, that it will take time. And it always happens when a police officer is involved, it takes years. But, if that was a member of the public, there would be an immediate arrest. There would be an immediate investigation. I don't think it's acceptable when it comes to police officers that there is a different set of rules for them. I mean, why should it take years to investigate why another individual was first kicked in the face and stomped in the head?
Yeah,
that was the bottom line. That was what happened.
Of course, and you're absolutely right. I wasn't suggesting it would take years, but even if it was a member of the public, as you rightly point out, there would be due process, wouldn't there? And
there would still be an arrest.
there would be a course of, but the investigation is happening now, to be fair to the police.
Yes,
They
but
need
I think
to.
he should be arrested. He should be sacked and arrested immediately for what he did. He should be arrested for what was on the video. He should go to court. And actually, I think, you know, what happens next will very much depend on the outcome of the various meetings I hear that are taking place today. We were told yesterday that there was going to be a meeting with all the elected representatives in the city and the police today. I want to know what the outcome of that is going to be before we make a decision moving forward.
Thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. I'm grateful to you for your time.
Thank you.
That is Naila Ashraf, who is, she's one of the organisers of those protests in Manchester, also co-chair of the campaign group Greater Manchester Stand Up to Racism. And there is certainly a sense of anger and unhappiness with certain sections of the community in Manchester about what has happened. I mean, it's a really interesting point that she makes there about, she says that she would like to see that police officer sacked and arrested. I guess the point I was trying to make was, even if it was a member of the public and you take out the fact that this was a police officer, there would still need to be an investigation.
Yes.
You wouldn't, there needs to be, you can't just sack somebody immediately. And it's better that you get the right outcome, even if that takes a couple of weeks or maybe a month. I'm not talking years down the track, but it's right that there is due process and there's not almost a knee-jerk reaction and indeed a policing reaction according to what people are saying. There needs to be examined. And as we heard there, from Joseph Timman from the Manchester Evening News, Andy Burnham has clearly seen different video footage. That may not change anything. That may just
it may not change
confirm what
anything,
happened.
but also,
But
if I
he
were
has seen
Greater
more.
Manchester Police and I were running their communications, I would release that footage as well, the body-worn camera footage, because that will give a great